Yes.
do the scene correctly, and you did many, many takes of it, which required him to eat a ton of sushi.
I told him not to. I told him don't do it. I said...
Robert De Niro had already become one of Scorsese's most important collaborators, but by the late 1970s, he was pushing for a project the director wasn't convinced about. De Niro had discovered Jake LaMotta's memoir, Raging Bull, My Story, and became fascinated by the contradictions inside it. LaMotta had been a celebrated middleweight champion, but his life outside the ring was filled with jealousy, anger, insecurity, and damaged relationships. To De Niro, this wasn't simply a boxing story. It was a portrait of a man fighting himself long after the audience had gone home. Scorsese initially resisted. He didn't see the movie De Niro was describing. Boxing wasn't his obvious passion, and after the disappointment of New York, he was in no condition to chase another demanding production. But De Niro kept returning to the idea. Eventually, the project found its way toward screenwriter Paul Schrader, whose work helped transform LaMotta's memoir into something far more psychological. The strange part was that while De Niro was trying to convince Scorsese to make the film, Scorsese's own life was beginning to resemble the damaged world inside the screenplay. Scorsese's problems were no longer limited to box office disappointment. His personal life was becoming increasingly unstable, and his health was suffering under years of pressure. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and using substances in a way that made everything more unpredictable. At the time, he could convince himself that certain habits were helping him work faster or think more clearly. In reality, the consequences were becoming harder to hide. Sleep disappeared, paranoia increased. His body was sending warnings that he wasn't listening to, yet he continued working, because stopping meant facing everything he had been avoiding. The production of The Last Waltz added even more pressure. Scorsese was trying to keep moving, while his physical condition deteriorated. Meanwhile, De Niro refused to abandon Raging Bull. He believed Scorsese was the only filmmaker capable of making the material feel personal, instead of turning it into a conventional sports movie. But before they could make it, Scorsese would face a crisis that neither of them could simply solve with another screenplay. In 1978, Scorsese's body finally forced the issue. During the Labor Day weekend, he traveled to the Telluride Film Festival, but his health was already in serious trouble. After returning to New York, his condition worsened dramatically. He was hospitalized and found to have a severe bleeding disorder, with doctors concerned about the possibility of a life-threatening complication. The details were terrifying. He was coughing blood and experiencing bleeding in several parts of his body. Years of asthma medication, prescription drugs, cocaine use, exhaustion, and stress had pushed him into a dangerous physical state. For someone whose entire identity revolved around movement, the hospital bed created a cruel reversal. He could no longer hide behind a camera or bury himself in another production. He had to lie still and confront what his life had become. Scorsese later acknowledged just how close he felt to giving up during that period. His career was uncertain, his family relationships were damaged, and his health had collapsed. Then De Niro arrived. He didn't come simply to check on his friend. He came carrying the project he had refused to let die. De Niro entered the hospital with the Raging Bull screenplay, but the movie wasn't the first thing he wanted to discuss. Scorsese was seriously ill, and De Niro knew that talking about budgets or production schedules would miss the point. Instead, he confronted his friend with a deeply personal question. Did Scorsese actually want to live? It was blunt, uncomfortable, and exactly what Scorsese needed to hear. De Niro reminded him that there was still work waiting, but more importantly, there was still a life beyond the hospital room. The director had spent years creating characters who were trapped by anger, addiction, guilt, and obsession. Now, he was trapped inside his own crisis. De Niro's message was essentially that the story didn't have to end there. He believed Scorsese still had something left to say, and Raging Bull could become the reason to say it. The project suddenly became more than another film. It became a test of whether Scorsese could imagine a future for himself. And once he finally agreed, the two men had to figure out how to make a movie that seemed almost impossible. After Scorsese recovered enough to leave the hospital, he and De Niro needed distance from the chaos surrounding them. They eventually went to St. Martin in the Caribbean, where they could work without the constant pressure of Hollywood. There, the screenplay became the center of their days. They went through scenes carefully, discussing Jake LaMotta's psychology and the people damaged by his behavior. De Niro wasn't interested in simply looking like a boxer. He wanted to understand how LaMotta's personality changed as his career evolved. Scorsese, meanwhile, began seeing the story through a more personal lens. The film wasn't really about winning fights. It was about what happens when a person cannot stop fighting, even against the people who love him. The quiet setting allowed both men to rethink the movie from the ground up. What had started as De Niro's obsession was becoming Scorsese's most personal project. But De Niro wasn't finished transforming himself for the role. He was about to make a physical commitment that would push the production into territory almost nobody expected. Robert De Niro didn't want to play Jake LaMotta from a distance. He wanted to disappear into him. He trained intensely for the boxing scenes, studying LaMotta's movements, and eventually stepping into real bouts to understand what it felt like to take punches from another fighter. But the transformation didn't stop there. De Niro wanted the audience to see the difference between LaMotta at the height of his career and the man he became afterward. So he gained a remarkable amount of weight for the later scenes. The physical change was dramatic, but Scorsese understood that appearance alone wouldn't carry the film. De Niro had to capture LaMotta's insecurity, jealousy, pride, and inability to control himself. That made the performance uncomfortable to watch, because the character could be both pathetic and frightening. Scorsese also decided that the movie should look different from the colorful Hollywood productions surrounding it. He chose black and white photography, giving the film an almost photographic quality. Every punch, pause, and expression felt exposed. Yet while they were creating something extraordinary, neither man knew how audiences would react. When Raging Bull was finally shown to people inside the industry, the response was not the triumphant celebration Scorsese might have expected after surviving his darkest period. Some early reactions were brutally negative. There were people who thought the movie was too violent, too bleak, too strange, or simply too difficult to market. Even people close to the production reportedly walked away from early screenings unsure whether Scorsese had made a masterpiece or a disaster. The film also struggled commercially when it reached theaters. For a director who had already experienced disappointment, this could have been devastating. But something important had changed. Scorsese was no longer making the movie to prove that he could deliver another hit. He had poured his fears, obsessions, and understanding of human weakness into it. De Niro's performance became the centerpiece, and critics eventually began recognizing what audiences had initially resisted. The film earned multiple Academy Award nominations, and De Niro won Best Actor. Scorsese, however, lost the directing award. The irony was difficult to miss. He had survived the crisis that inspired the film, created one of his most respected works, and still left Oscar night without the prize everyone expected. Raging Bull helped restore Scorsese's reputation, but success did not magically erase the problems that had brought him to the hospital. His relationships had already suffered. Years of relentless work had created distance between him and his children, and no award could return the moments he had missed. His next projects continued to divide audiences. The King of Comedy, another collaboration with De Niro, was initially met with confusion and rejection, rather than celebration. Yet Scorsese kept making films that refused to behave like ordinary Hollywood entertainment. Slowly, something else began changing. Instead of trying to escape the world that had shaped him, he started bringing it closer to the camera. His parents, Catherine and Charles, appeared in his work. The people, accents, humor, religion, food, and complicated family relationships of his childhood became part of his cinematic language. The neighborhood he once watched from a window had become one of the most recognizable worlds in American filmmaking. Scorsese had survived, but his greatest transformation was not simply staying alive. It was learning how to turn his own past into something that could outlast him. For decades, De Niro remained one of Scorsese's most important collaborators, but his influence extended beyond the films they made together. During the production of This Boy's Life, De Niro worked alongside a young Leonardo DiCaprio. He noticed something unusual in the teenager's performance, and later recommended him to Scorsese. That recommendation mattered. Scorsese and DiCaprio eventually formed another major director-actor partnership, producing films such as Gangs of New York, The Aviator, The Departed, Shutter Island, The Wolf of Wall Street, and Killers of the Flower Moon. In a strange way, De Niro's role in Scorsese's career had evolved. He was no longer simply the actor who played Johnny Boy or Jake LaMotta. He had become someone who helped connect Scorsese to the next generation of performers. Then, in 2007, the director finally reached a moment that had seemed impossible decades earlier. After years of nominations and disappointments, Scorsese finally won the Academy Award for Best Director for The Departed. The boy who once watched movies from a window had finally received Hollywood's biggest directing honor. When Scorsese finally won his directing Oscar, the moment was emotional, but it could not erase everything that came before it. The award arrived nearly 3 decades after his health crisis, and after years of films that had been ignored, criticized, or misunderstood. It also arrived after the personal sacrifices that success had demanded. His relationship with his daughters had been affected by his obsession with filmmaking, and those lost years could never simply be recovered. Yet Scorsese's life eventually entered another chapter. Later in life, he became a father again to Francesca, and he has spoken about how fatherhood at an older age changed his perspective. Instead of seeing filmmaking as the only place where his imagination belonged, he found himself sharing that creativity at home. Francesca eventually became involved with cameras and filmmaking herself, creating a completely different relationship between father and daughter. The contrast was striking. Decades earlier, Scorsese had been the father whose work pulled him away from his children. Now, a daughter could pick up a camera and bring him into her world. But the most powerful chapter of his friendship with De Niro was still waiting decades later. Scorsese and De Niro eventually went long stretches without making movies together. But the friendship never disappeared. Their reunion in The Irishman carried a completely different feeling from their early collaborations. Instead of young men chasing power, the story followed aging criminals confronting regret and loneliness. De Niro's character sits with the consequences of a lifetime of choices, making the film feel almost like a reflection on aging itself. By then, Scorsese and De Niro had lived through careers most filmmakers could only dream about. But their story was never really about the movies alone. It was about trust built over decades. And then came another reunion. Killers of the Flower Moon brought De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio together under Scorsese's direction, creating a striking connection between 2 eras of his career. De Niro represented the partnership that had helped rescue Scorsese decades earlier, while DiCaprio represented the actor who became central to his later work. The collaboration showed just how long Scorsese's creative relationships could survive. More importantly, it proved that the director was still exploring difficult stories well into his 80s. The man who once struggled simply to finish a movie was still behind the camera, still taking risks. Years after the hospital crisis, Scorsese's life looked completely different. He had survived, raised a family, made dozens of films, and earned the directing Oscar that once seemed impossibly distant. De Niro had also remained part of that journey. Their friendship had outlasted failed movies, changing careers, personal struggles, and long periods without working together. What De Niro offered in 1978 wasn't a guarantee that everything would become perfect. He simply reminded Scorsese that there was still something unfinished. And sometimes, that is enough to keep someone moving forward. Decades later, their friendship could look surprisingly ordinary. Instead of discussing scripts or careers, De Niro could simply call Scorsese to say goodnight. That small gesture carried enormous meaning because of everything that had happened before it. In 1978, De Niro had entered a hospital room when Scorsese's future was uncertain. Years later, the two could casually talk, knowing there was another day ahead. The grand Hollywood story had become something much simpler: two old friends, still expecting to see each other tomorrow. The most powerful part of Scorsese and De Niro's story isn't an Oscar, a box office success, or even Raging Bull. It's the word tomorrow. In that hospital room, De Niro forced Scorsese to think beyond the moment he was trapped inside. The director eventually walked out, returned to filmmaking, rebuilt his career, became a father again, and continued creating into his 80s. De Niro couldn't promise what the future would bring. He could only remind his friend that the story wasn't finished, and decades later, their friendship still carried the same message. Sometimes surviving means simply believing there will be another day. In September 1978, Martin Scorsese was only 35 years old, but his body was behaving like it had reached the end of the road. He was in a New York hospital, dangerously ill and bleeding from multiple parts of his body. Doctors feared that the situation could become catastrophic at any moment. For a filmmaker who had spent years turning violence, fear, guilt, and desperation into unforgettable stories, this was no longer something happening on a movie screen. It was happening to him. Then Robert De Niro walked into the room. He could have offered sympathy. Instead, he confronted Scorsese with a question that went far deeper than his illness. Did he actually want to keep living? De Niro also brought something else with him: a screenplay that had been following them for years. Scorsese had almost no reason to believe his career, his family life, or his health could be repaired. Yet that unfinished script represented something he had not completely lost: a reason to get out of that bed. And to understand why De Niro's words mattered so much, you have to go back to the beginning. Long before Martin Scorsese became one of Hollywood's most respected directors, he was a sick child watching New York from behind glass. Born in 1942, he grew up in a Sicilian-American family that eventually settled in Little Italy. But childhood did not give him the freedom other kids enjoyed. Scorsese suffered from severe asthma, sometimes requiring special treatment and making ordinary activities feel dangerous. While other children played outside, he often had to stay indoors. That isolation could have become a prison. Instead, it became a doorway. His parents began taking him to movie theaters, where the darkness gave him access to worlds his body could not. Westerns, crime stories, religious dramas, and larger-than-life characters became his playground. He began studying movies almost obsessively, remembering scenes and drawing images from them afterward. The strange part is that the boy who could not easily participate in the world outside eventually became obsessed with creating worlds of his own. But cinema wasn't the only force shaping him. Another powerful influence was waiting just outside the theater. Scorsese's childhood neighborhood became more than the place where he grew up. It became the raw material for the movies he would eventually make. Little Italy was crowded, loud, intensely personal, and filled with people whose relationships were shaped by family loyalty, religion, pride, money, and fear. Those contradictions fascinated him. He saw men who could appear warm one moment and intimidating the next. He saw families argue, forgive, separate, and come back together. Years later, those same emotional patterns would appear throughout his films. His characters rarely fit neatly into categories like good or evil. They were usually caught somewhere in between. Religion was another major influence. Scorsese was deeply affected by Catholic rituals, churches, images of suffering, and the idea of guilt. For a time, he even considered becoming a priest. But there was a problem. His curiosity about movies, music, women, and the world outside the seminary kept pulling him in another direction. Eventually, the priesthood disappeared from his plans. Cinema didn't. And once Scorsese entered that world seriously, his life began moving in a completely different direction. For a young Scorsese, becoming a priest seemed like a possible way to understand the complicated emotions constantly running through his mind. But his rebellious side made that future difficult to maintain. He eventually left the seminary and found another institution that would change his life: New York University. There, film became more than an escape. It became a language. One professor in particular recognized that Scorsese's nervous energy and obsession with movies could be transformed into something powerful. Instead of telling him to calm down, he pushed him to create. Scorsese began experimenting with short films that were strange, provocative, and sometimes deliberately uncomfortable. One of the most famous was The Big Shave, a brief film in which an ordinary man repeatedly shaves until the peaceful bathroom becomes a disturbing image of blood and self-destruction. There was almost no explanation. The image did the talking. It revealed something about the filmmaker emerging behind the camera. Scorsese wasn't interested in making audiences comfortable. He wanted them to feel something. But making provocative short films at NYU was one thing. Building an actual career in Hollywood would prove much harder. Scorsese's first feature was not an instant masterpiece or a Hollywood breakthrough. Who's That Knocking at My Door? Took years to develop, with limited resources and plenty of uncertainty surrounding it. He was trying to turn his personal experiences and observations of young men in New York into a story that felt authentic. The process was slow, frustrating, and financially difficult. When the film finally began attracting attention, Scorsese discovered that finishing a movie did not guarantee that anyone would care about it. Rejection followed. He taught, worked on other productions, and kept looking for opportunities. Then came Boxcar Bertha, a professional directing assignment that gave him a chance to work on a larger production. But the experience left him with an uncomfortable realization. He had made a movie, yet it didn't completely sound like him. John Cassavetes, one of the filmmakers Scorsese admired, reportedly gave him a blunt assessment that stayed with him. The lesson was simple. Getting hired wasn't the same as finding your voice. Scorsese returned to the people and streets he understood best. And soon, someone else would enter his life, who understood that world almost instinctively. Scorsese had learned a painful lesson. Hollywood could give him work without giving him a voice. Then Robert De Niro entered the picture. The two men had known of each other around New York, but their real creative connection began when De Niro saw Who's That Knocking at My Door? And recognized something familiar in it. Their relationship gained momentum through mutual connections, conversations, and a shared understanding of the neighborhood Scorsese was trying to put on screen. De Niro wasn't simply another actor looking for a role. He understood the nervous energy, street humor, aggression, and vulnerability that Scorsese had been observing since childhood. When Scorsese began developing what would become Mean Streets, De Niro immediately seemed capable of bringing that world to life. If you enjoy stories about the hidden moments that shaped Hollywood's biggest careers, like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the next part of this story reveals how one performance changed the trajectory of both men's careers. De Niro eventually became Johnny Boy, a reckless character who seemed incapable of thinking about tomorrow. Scorsese recognized that personality instantly. What happened next would turn their friendship into one of cinema's most important partnerships. When De Niro stepped into Mean Streets as Johnny Boy, he didn't behave like an actor carefully demonstrating a character. He seemed to become the character. Johnny Boy was charming, unpredictable, funny, and dangerous, often within the same scene. Scorsese understood that this contradiction was exactly what made people from his old neighborhood so fascinating. De Niro's performance had a loose, almost chaotic energy, but there was precision underneath it. He knew when to push a moment and when to let silence do the work. The film itself was not a conventional gangster story. It was about young men trying to balance friendship, religion, loyalty, ambition, and violence, while knowing they might never escape the environment surrounding them. For Scorsese, it was deeply personal. For De Niro, it became proof that taking risks could create something unforgettable. Mean Streets did not suddenly make them the biggest names in Hollywood, but it established a creative language they could share. They had found a way to turn their New York experiences into cinema. And their next collaboration would take that idea somewhere much darker. 3 years later, Scorsese and De Niro returned with Taxi Driver, and this time they created a character who was far harder to understand. Travis Bickle was lonely, disconnected, increasingly obsessed with the ugliness he believed surrounded him. De Niro prepared intensely for the role, spending time driving a taxi around New York and observing the city from behind the wheel. The preparation helped him capture the strange emptiness of a man constantly surrounded by people while remaining completely isolated. One of the film's most memorable moments came from De Niro's famous mirror scene, which developed through improvisation. The performance felt uncomfortable because it never completely explained Travis. Instead, viewers were forced to watch his mind deteriorate through his behavior. Scorsese's camera made New York feel both alive and threatening, almost like another character. The result was a film that divided audiences but became impossible to ignore. It also pushed the director into a level of controversy he had never experienced before. Soon, Hollywood executives were worried about something much more immediate: how far Scorsese had gone with the ending. The climax of Taxi Driver created serious concerns because of its graphic violence. Studio officials worried about the rating and the commercial consequences. Scorsese, meanwhile, believed that softening the film too much could destroy the emotional impact of what he had built. The pressure became intense enough that he reportedly feared the studio might make changes he could not accept. Instead of removing the sequence entirely, the filmmakers found another solution. The color and appearance of the violence were altered to reduce its graphic intensity while preserving the scene's basic structure. It was a compromise, but one that allowed the movie to survive intact enough to reach theaters. Then came Cannes, where Taxi Driver won the Palme d'Or, and suddenly Scorsese was no longer just a promising young filmmaker from New York. He had become an international name. But success brought another problem. The more attention Scorsese received professionally, the more difficult it became to keep his personal life together. His career was accelerating, but something behind the scenes was beginning to fall apart. By the middle of the 1970s, Scorsese had achieved what the young boy behind the Little Italy window could barely have imagined. He was making ambitious movies, working with major stars, and becoming one of the most talked-about directors of his generation. But his professional momentum did not mean his personal life was stable. His marriage was deteriorating. His relationship with his children was becoming complicated, and the pressure of constantly creating seemed to follow him everywhere. Then came New York, New York, an ambitious musical starring De Niro and Liza Minnelli. Scorsese wanted to make something different, but the production became increasingly difficult. The movie was expensive, demanding, and creatively exhausting. When it failed to connect with audiences the way Taxi Driver had, the disappointment hit hard. Scorsese was already struggling with exhaustion and emotional pressure, and his lifestyle was becoming increasingly dangerous. What had once seemed like unstoppable ambition was beginning to look like self-destruction. And while Scorsese was losing control of his own life, De Niro was becoming obsessed with a completely different story, one about a fighter named Jake LaMotta.